Good morning. I'm glad you have chosen to join us again this morning as we continue our lesson on the law. We are still inside for another week. It's not quite as bad as it was last week in terms of the heat, but it's still pretty warm, and so we're going to be in here for at least one more week. If it cools down a little bit more, we'll go back outside and look for the deer in next week's lesson. But for this week, we're back inside. And Boba's mama is out shopping again today, so he is here monitoring our progress as we make the video. So there's Boba. He's sitting in the big chair, just keeping track of everything that is going on. In the last lesson, we saw how God expects those in the covenant to interact with Him. In essence, what God was saying was, it was important for the nations to see how His people would relate with Him. And by doing so, they would not bring chaos or injustice into their society, because He was in a process of changing the way that societies work in general. Instead of focusing how I can get ahead in the world, instead of focusing on having the good life and fighting with everyone else to climb the ladder of success, the focus would be on building a relationship with Yahweh, and that was then built into the covenant. In other words, what He wanted was the nations to be able to see that a relationship with Him was a way, really the only way, of changing the way that fulfillment comes in life. And He needed His people to demonstrate that to the rest of the world. That was basically what we talked about last week. Last week was focused on, you shall have no other gods before me. You will not make any engraved image. You will not take my name and use my name for vain purposes. And you will keep the Sabbath day holy as a gift to you, and also as a weekly reminder that as I worked 6 days and rested on the seventh, you will work 6 days and rest on the seventh. That is a reminder to us that we are His imagers. However, there was more to the covenant than just showing how great Yahweh is in our interactions with Him. Yahweh wanted His people to also demonstrate to the world that a life with Him is the only way to have the good life. And that would also include how they treat each other. That a community with Him brought things like justice and peace and order and kindness to the community. And since these are things that we all seek after in our personal lives and in our community, by demonstrating to the rest of the world that you could have that with Yahweh as your God, with Yahweh as the focus, then the rest of the world would be drawn to Him. And this means that we need to now look at the second group of the commandments. Now, as I said last week, the people in the ancient world would not have seen a list of how to interact with your God as being an unusual thing. The things that God put into the list may have seemed unusual, but the fact that there was a list, that would not have been that unusual in the ancient world. However, the second group, the group that the Hebrew people were supposed to follow, the group that related to how I interact with people around me, that would have been a little bit more unusual. Yet keep in mind, after Moses read the terms of the covenant to the people, they all agreed that they would follow this second group as well as the first group, even though it may have seemed a little unusual to them to follow a group of rules that their God set up that focused on how to live with each other. Now, sometimes in the church, we have this idea that the first group, that's the most important group. And the second group is important, it's just not as important. You can get that idea, although somewhat incorrectly, but you can get that idea when Jesus answered the question that was posed to him, who or what is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, we can go to Matthew chapter 22 and see this interaction that Jesus has with the Pharisees. It's a lawyer that was also a member of the Pharisees. So in Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 34, it says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he," talking about Jesus, "but when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. 'Teacher, Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' And he," Jesus, "said to him," the lawyer, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets.'" So if we take a look at Jesus' answer and don't look at it from the standpoint of the covenant, we're just looking at the answer blindly, it would make it sound like that loving God is the most important. Loving other people, it's important. We'll get around to that, but first, the most important thing is loving God. But when we look at that answer with the covenant as the background, we can see a slightly different reason that Jesus gave this answer. Remember, we enter into the covenant. So we enter into this covenant as we make the decision to focus our lives on God. In other words, I am going to love God, and therefore I am going to enter into this covenant relationship with Him. But once I'm in the covenant, then my focus must also be on how I show love to other people. That's basically what Jesus is saying. So yes, it is true that the greatest commandment is to love God, and that's because loving God, or I should say, loving people, is really not an issue if I don't love God. I mean, if I don't love God enough to enter into the covenant relationship, then all of these Hebrew laws that God puts into place really have no bearing on my life. I'm not going to enter into the covenant relationship anyway. I don't love God enough to do that. Therefore, the rest of it, how I interact with other people, who cares? I'm not part of the covenant. So we can see that loving my neighbor is not less important. It's just, it has no real purpose in terms of my life if I'm not part of the covenant. If I'm not part of the covenant relationship, it really is, the terms of the covenant really don't necessarily have anything to do with me. So as I enter into the covenant relationship, because I love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, I then accept the second part of the terms of the covenant, which are, I will also love my neighbor as myself. So when we understand this answer that Jesus gave in terms of the covenant, we can see it's not that one is more important than the other. It's one has to happen, or the other group really doesn't play much of a role. That's in essence what Jesus was trying to say. So, don't get the idea that we covered the important ones last week and now we're going to cover the ones that are less important. The ones today are just as important. So let's look at the terms of the covenant as it pertains to the second grouping. Remember, I'm supposed to show love to others. That's my good works. When Jesus said, "Let your light shine before men that they may see your good works," that's what he's talking about. He's talking about loving my neighbor as myself. Those are the good works. That's the second part of the terms of the covenant. So let's look at these, what these are. The first one says, honor your father and your mother. Now, it's a little bit longer, and you can read that on your own. But basically, what the covenant, the term of the covenant is saying is, I am to honor my parents. Now, sometimes in the church, we say, well, that means that you are to obey your parents. In fact, Paul talks about that in the book of Ephesians. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And that's not completely incorrect. A child is supposed to obey his or her parents. That is part of the covenant relationship. But what about adult life? Am I still supposed to obey all the wishes of my parents when I reach the level of an adult? No, that is not what the covenant is saying. I'm not saying obeying your parents in the Lord is necessarily a bad thing, but what I'm saying is if an adult has a difference of opinion on how they're to live their life than what their parents think that they should, well, the adult child lives his or her life based on how he or she believes that God wants him or her to do so. And it doesn't really have anything to do with what his or her parents think. If his or her parents think that he or she should be a doctor, but he or she feels like that God is calling him or her out to the mission field, then you go to the mission field. You don't obey your parents, is what I'm trying to say. Well, if that's not what it means, then what does it mean to honor your father and your mother? And to really understand this, we're going to have to look at the ancient Eastern culture. This is the way that God would have meant for it to be interpreted, because this is the way the ancient Hebrews would have interpreted it. In the ancient Asian culture, which is where the ancient Hebrew people are living, that entire culture, to honor someone did not necessarily mean to obey them. It meant that they would live their lives in such a way that it would bring honor to the parent, the teacher, or the mentor. We can see this in Asian culture. We can see this in Asian literature. Individuals would honor their parent, or honor their teacher, or honor their mentor. What that meant was that they lived in such a way that the community would honor the parent, the teacher, or the mentor because of the life of the child or the student. Not that the child or the student just always obeyed them, but they would live a life that the community as a whole would find honorable, and then that would give honor to the parent, the teacher, or the mentor. Now, this did have the benefit of helping the parents, for instance. So if we leave the idea of the Asian culture behind and go back to the law where God says to honor your father and your mother, that idea does bring some benefit to the parents. That is true, because the community would look at that situation and honor the parents, would look highly at the parents. The parents would have an elevated position in the community in terms of being honored simply because their children live a particular way. However, it's actually more than that. And we need to look at this in terms of the first of the covenants that's focused almost entirely on the community. Once God established a generation with a particular culture in mind, and that culture would be based on the law. So everyone in this first generation is building their lives on the law, on the terms of this covenant that they have with Yahweh. Once that has been established, the next generation, if they are to honor the first generation, bring honor to the first generation. If the second generation is to bring honor to the first generation, they would do so by keeping the same standard of life. Once the terms of the covenant were in place, and everyone in the community looked at the idea of a life following the law, following the terms of the covenant that they have with Yahweh. Once that has been established, and we'll say in generation 1, in order for generation 2 to bring honor to generation 1, they would have to have the same standards. If they kept the same standards, if they kept the same norms as had been established in the first generation, then the community as a whole would honor those in their community because the next generation, they had the same established norms. Well, that second generation is living their lives in such a way that it brings honor to the first generation, and they have established those exact same community norms. Well, the next generation, if they are going to bring honor to their parents, well, then they're going to have to continue with those exact same established norms. And so this would continue on and on and on, generation after generation after generation. And what we really see that Yahweh is doing here is once he gets that first generation established with certain community norms, they live according to the terms of the covenant. The next generation will have to accept those same established norms if they're going to honor their parents. And then the generation after that will have to accept those same norms if they're going to honor their parents. And so once it's all in place, society would continue with peace and order and justice because of just that one commandment: bring honor to your parents. And that is in essence what Yahweh is trying to establish with this. He's trying to establish a method that keeps the community, generation after generation after generation, focused on that same established norm. This is why the punishment for a violation of this law was so harsh. And some people might even say unusually cruel. If we go to Exodus chapter 21, we can see an example of this. In Exodus 21, verse 15, it says, Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. We can see this idea that if you do things that dishonor your parents, bring dishonor to the way that they raised you, you are put to death. So we can see from that one passage there in Exodus that the penalty for bringing dishonor onto your parents was very harsh. Why? Because the parents, first off, the parents did need to be protected as much as the community does in order to be a light to the nations. But every bit as important as just protecting the parents is protecting the community. You see, if the community begins to crumble, then they will no longer serve as a light to the nations, and God's plan that He has put into place will fail. So the way you maintain that constant norm in the community is establish it up front. This is the norm. And then from then on, every generation after that keeps the same established norm simply because that's what it takes to bring honor to their parents. So honor your father and your mother serves an important function in terms of building a community and maintaining a community that brings honor to Yahweh so that He is able to work through their good works and draw the nations to Himself. The second term of the covenant that in some way relates to how I interact with other people is you shall not murder. Now this is another one of the terms of the covenant that has multiple purposes. As we've already stated, Yahweh's plan is to have a very peaceful, orderly, just society so that the rest of the nations would see that and desire Him to be their God. Allowing murder is never going to accomplish this. If the nations never see a difference between Yahweh's people and the community they live in, then they would never want to be a part of Yahweh's community and enter into a covenant relationship with Him. And anything as destructive as murder would be very destructive to the societal order. And that would then, of course, reflect negatively on Yahweh. So that's the first reason that Yahweh says you cannot commit murder. But there's also another reason. If we go back to the idea that humanity, humans, were created to be imagers of God, imagers of Yahweh, then it is important to realize that if we're all equal imagers, then we're all equal. And we can see that in Genesis chapter 9. God says in Genesis chapter 9, beginning in verse 5, "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning." We can see this idea of a reckoning, a vengeance, a making things right idea. "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in His own image." So what we see is God says that when it comes to my imagers, I am going to make things right. Why? Because everyone is equally valued. When we allow murder to take place, and there is no reckoning for that, basically the assailant is saying that his or her life is just simply more important than the life of the victim. And Yahweh is coming along and he's saying, no, it's not. Now, you may say, well, there were other nations that opposed murder as well, and that is true. Most nations in the ancient world, in order to maintain discipline and order to whatever degree they wanted, did not permit murder. However, bear in mind that in these ancient laws, there was a differentiation based on societal levels. In other words, someone from a lower class would never be allowed to harm someone from an upper class. If they did, the punishment would be swift and absolute. However, if someone from an upper class harmed someone that was in a lower class, it's not necessarily the same. We could look at the famous law code of Hammurabi that was established in ancient Babylon in the 1700s BC, which was really famous for demanding punishment that fit the crime. But it did differentiate based on class. So if someone from a lower class were to injure someone that was in the upper class, then the penalty was an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If you knocked out one of their eyes, your eye would be knocked out as well. But that was not necessarily true if you were in the upper class. If you were in a higher class and you damaged someone's eye in the lower class, you just had to pay the lower class victim money. Now, depending on the severity of the injury, the money might be fairly low or it might be fairly high. But it would be something that you would have had available to you. So, yes, you might have to pay this person a year's wages, but you would have had that money on hand. So you could have done it. Some have said that, well, that's pretty good for the person who got his or her eye knocked out. Yeah, that is, but that's not establishing that everyone is equal. If the person in the upper class only has to pay money that they have anyway, and it's not an inconvenience really to them to have to do that, then that is not the same as the person in the lower class having to endure an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Yahweh comes along and he says, no, that is not the way it's supposed to be. I have formed everyone as equal imagers. Therefore, there can be no differentiation based on punishment or the reckoning. In fact, in Exodus chapter 21, we see that the death penalty was prescribed even if the victim was a servant or a slave. So if we go to Exodus 21, verse 20, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Now again, that goes back to God's statement earlier in Genesis where there will be a reckoning. And the reckoning is a life for a life. So when God says this in Exodus, that if an individual strikes another individual, regardless of the social class, and that person dies from that, there's a reckoning. It's a life for a life. So Yahweh is very clear that his view was vastly different than the view of the world. Everyone is an imager. And everyone can always image Yahweh regardless of their social class. It doesn't matter if you're in an upper class or a lower class, everyone can image Yahweh. And no one has the right to take the life of one of Yahweh's imagers except Yahweh. He's the only one that can do that. Now, seeing life this way put Yahweh's people in a very different position. It's a community standard that might not always appeal to the wealthy and the powerful. They may not want to be treated the same as those of the lower class. But it was very desirable and attractive to people especially in the lower class, that were not accustomed to being treated as an equal in terms of standards within the community with people in the upper class. And that would then enable Yahweh to work through his people and draw those in the other nations to him. That was the uniqueness of Yahweh's law, you shall not murder. He did not have any type of differentiation because everyone was equal in terms of being one of his imagers. Now the next law was, you shall not commit adultery. Once again, it's a law that has multiple purposes. First off, it shows Yahweh's concern about the well-being of his followers. You got to keep in mind, when two individuals enter into a marriage covenant relationship, it's a very personal decision and commitment. And to violate, to damage that commitment, damages the other person. It's not like entering into a covenant relationship with the mortgage company. You know, if that covenant relationship gets damaged, okay, you may have to pay a penalty, you may have to pay a fine or something, and the mortgage company, it's not like the owner of the mortgage company is deeply personally injured because of that. But when you violate the covenant relationship of marriage, there can easily be emotional and psychological damage that can come from that. Now, is it possible for the individual to recover? Well, sure. God formed us with the ability to some degree get past those injuries. But even if we get past the injuries, most of the time there is a scar, a deep scar from the injury that comes from violating the marriage covenant. And Yahweh's love for his people would never allow him to say, oh yeah, I'm okay with you inflicting deep emotional injury onto someone else, just so that you can go out and have a good time. Yahweh is saying you can never do that to another person, just so you can pursue your own enjoyment. In fact, when we take this one law to its logical conclusion, what Yahweh is saying is, you cannot do anything that will cause damage to another person just so you can have an enjoyable life. You can't do that. In fact, anything that we do that benefits ourselves at the expense of another person, damages another person, and that's why we're doing it. I'm damaging you just so that I can have a better life. Yahweh would say that's a violation of the covenant. You can't act that way. So why is that so important? Well, that's important because Yahweh is trying to build a community that puts the well-being of the collective above the happiness of the individual. That I never damage other people just so that I can get my way. Yahweh is saying, no, you can't do that. we always try to put the other person's best interest ahead of our own enjoyment, if you will. Once again, if we live that way, Yahweh is saying, I can use those good works to draw the nations to myself. So again, that's the purpose of that particular law. We go to the next law. The next law says you cannot steal. This is another law that has multiple purposes. First off, we do need to look at the geographic location of God's people. If you go back and you watch the first video in this series, you will see this explained in a lot of detail, but I'm just going to briefly remind you. God put His people in a particular location. And His reason for putting His people in that particular location is because that location contained many of the trade routes between the superpowers. So again, once again, we have the Mesopotamians, we have the Assyrians, the Babylonians, those are in the ancient Mesopotamia. We have Egyptians, those are in ancient Egypt. Then we have people like the Hittites, the Syrians, the Mitanni, the people in Anatolia. The Hittites were in Anatolia. So we have the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, Anatolia, the Syrians, Mitanni right here, and they are all dependent on each other for trade. And those trade routes came right there. They all came through, or most of the trade routes came through that one little spot. That's where God put His people. Now, you can go online and you can find out for yourself what each of the groups had in terms of products that the other superpowers would want, but they traded with each other extensively. This meant, since God put His people in that one particular place, what that meant was God was going to use His people to influence culture around the world. Now you say, well, it also gave them put them in a great position to gain wealth. And you're right. A lot of biblical scholars believe this is why Solomon fortified or defended the three cities of Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. You can see on this map, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer are all right along the trade route called the Via Maris. So taxing those trade routes really did bring a lot of wealth into Solomon's coffers. That's really true. He did become very wealthy from taxing those trade routes. But the primary focus is this gave Yahweh's people an opportunity to interact with individuals from all over the known world at the time. And they would see firsthand, the people from the other nations would see firsthand how Yahweh's people treated other people. They didn't try to cheat them. They didn't try to rob them. They didn't try to steal from them. They didn't try to manipulate the economic situation so that they could take advantage of these other individuals on the trade routes. They had honest business dealings. They were treated fairly. And the people then would see that as different. In the other nations where they were doing business, they had to always be careful because people would always be trying to get the better deal and try to take advantage of the situation and cheat and steal and all those other things. But when they interacted with Yahweh's people, oh, it's a different world. I don't have to have my guard up all the time. I know that I will be treated right. And that would then reflect on Yahweh Himself. Now, there's also another reason that this law was so important, and that is because what a thief is saying when he or she steals from another person is, I am not satisfied with the blessings that Yahweh gives to me, and therefore I am entitled to take his blessings that he's given to you and take them for myself. That is a very destructive mindset. And it very much goes back to my relationship with Yahweh in general. If I'm not pleased with what he has given to me, to the point that I think I have a right to take his blessings away from you, then it's not just that I'm harming you. That says a lot about my relationship with Yahweh. So that particular commandment peers directly into the heart of the individual who is breaking it, because it speaks to my relationship with Yahweh, not just my relationship with other people. The next term of the covenant or commandment is, you will not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, to some, this is a command, don't lie. This is God's way of saying you cannot lie. And again, I'm not saying that that is totally untrue. But if we really want to understand what this commandment is saying, we must look back at the original intent, the original purpose of what Yahweh was trying to tell his people. Now, in a world where eyewitness testimony was used to establish guilt or innocence of an individual, to falsely testify against another individual in a legal justice proceeding could cause an innocent person to be found guilty. Could cause a guilty person to be found innocent. Now, if you're just talking about, did you step onto my yard? Well, that's not that big of a deal. But when you progress to the point that I may be a false witness in a murder case, and my witness could cause an innocent person to be found guilty of murder, and we've already seen the penalty for murder is death. In other words, my false witness causes the execution of another person. Now it becomes a little bit more serious. And Yahweh said, even in his laws, in Deuteronomy chapter 19, beginning in verse 15, a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. So even Yahweh says, you get 2 or 3 witnesses that come forward and say a person did something, that can stand up in court. This is why it was especially important for an individual to not speak falsely when they were testifying in a legal proceeding. It was so important that Yahweh even had a very, very, what some would consider harsh penalty if you're found doing that. We can see in Deuteronomy chapter 19, so if we stay there in Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 16, if a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, so this is a witness that is doing this for malicious reasons, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priest and the judges who are in the office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him, that's the witness, as he had meant you to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear in fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So what is Yahweh saying here? Well, as harsh as this may seem, what Yahweh is saying is, if an individual testifies falsely, and it's found out that that individual testified falsely, then whatever the penalty was going to be of the person that was being accused of the crime, that's the penalty that you put onto the false witness. Yahweh understood that people might consider that harsh. And notice that he even says, you shall not pity the person. The reason that he says that is because if we use this as this example. Here's our example. We say, person 1 kills somebody, but he doesn't want to be blamed for it. He wants person 2 to be blamed for it. So person 1 goes to his friend and says, hey, you join with me and we will accuse person 2 of committing the murder. And person 1 and his friend do that. We'll also say that the courts figure out the truth. And person 1 and his friend are found out to be false witnesses. Most people would say, yes, you need to execute person 1. He's the murderer. Okay, so we execute person 1. But what about his friend? Do we execute his friend? Well, all too often we would say, well, you know, kind of the no harm, no foul. You know, it's not person 2. It's not like person 2 was damaged in any way. No, we don't want to execute the false witness. There should be a penalty of some kind, but we don't execute the false witness. But notice that Yahweh says, your eye shall not pity. What that means is, since person 2 was being accused of murder, and person 1's friend was testifying falsely against him, the friend gets executed too. That's Yahweh's law. Now, why is it so harsh? I mean, doesn't that seem a little harsh when person 2, they didn't get executed? It's not like they were punished for a crime they didn't commit. It was found out. You got to keep in mind that in those days, we didn't have the forensic evidence and things that we do today. Eyewitness testimony is a big part of what they had. If you couldn't trust eyewitness testimony, then the entire legal system would fall apart. And Yahweh places an enormous amount of value on justice. I mean, it's an incredible amount of value. We can see this in Micah chapter 6, where God is talking to his people, Yahweh is talking to his people. Beginning with verse 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? With calves a year old? In other words, God is saying, do you bring, is what I'm looking for, am I looking for offerings from you? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Again, huge numbers of offerings. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Would Yahweh be pleased if I was so repentant that I'm willing to sacrifice my own child because of my transgression? He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. That is what Yahweh values. And again, sometimes we have this idea that, oh, you know, the law has all of these sacrifices and those things were so important in order for the people to remain in good standing with God. And I'm not saying that it wasn't an aspect of that. But let's not get so carried away with this idea of sacrifices that we lose sight of the fact that in essence God is saying, I don't care about sacrifices. Not when you are acting in ways that are unjust, that are not merciful, and that don't include humility. Keep your sacrifices. Give me a community that's just, merciful, and humble. You see, that's what is so different between Yahweh and the gods of the ancient world. The gods of the ancient world were only concerned about sacrifices, being treated with honor, their idols being put in amazing temples. Yahweh said, I don't care about all that kind of stuff in comparison to the way I want you to build the community. Why? Because I want my community, I want my people to be different so that I can work through their good works to draw the nations to me. If my people have a just community and people are treated justly, it doesn't really matter what level of status you have in the community, everyone is treated justly. If my people treat each other mercifully, if my people walk before me humbly, following my instructions, then I can work with all of that and draw the nations. Just bringing me a bunch of sacrifices, that doesn't accomplish the plan. And again, folks, I'm trying to say once again that this is all about the plan. The plan to restore the nations into a proper relationship with Yahweh. This isn't about Yahweh being treated a particular way. This is all about you treat me a particular way, you treat those around you a particular way, so that I can draw the nations to me. So if you have a society where people say, well, where's the justice? Where's the kindness? Well, I can't work with that. I can't entice people to come back to me when you as my people are unjust. When you are as my people are unkind to each other. And a fair judicial system is crucial. It's critical to having a society that is built on peace and order. In many ways, an unfair judicial system can be the single most destructive force in bringing unity within a community. You just almost can't be unified when some people are treated one way and other people are treated another way. Yahweh understands this, and He's trying to get His people to understand it. When people in a community really have no hope of fairness, that powerful, rich people can destroy the lives of poor, neglected people at will, the judicial system breaks down and there is no unity in the community. I mean, it's just, it is so destructive. And this is why Yahweh makes such a big deal of this, that if you do anything to damage the judicial process, then the penalty for that is whatever the person is being accused of. Even if You think that is too harsh. It doesn't matter. You do not show pity, because I, Yahweh, understand the destruction that comes when a judicial system is unfair, even if you don't necessarily understand it. The last of the laws says you shall not covet. Now, it then gives a list of all the things that they're not to covet, but it ends up saying, or anything that is your neighbor's. And in reality, this law is in many ways the culmination of all of the other laws. To desire what belongs to someone else. Now, I do want you to understand, to covet doesn't mean my friend has a 1978 280Z. I wish I had a 1978 280Z so we could have this in common and we can enjoy our 280Zs together. That's not coveting. To covet meant I see my friend's 1978 280Z and I want it. At his loss, I want his 280Z to be mine. I want to take away his so that I can have that. What Yahweh is saying is, don't even think that way. Don't even let that be the way that you think. Because if you never covet, well, you'll never steal from somebody else. If you never covet your neighbor's spouse, then you would never commit adultery. If you didn't covet that person's life, you definitely wouldn't commit murder. You see, these sins that we see in the Old Testament, many of them, I'm not going to say all of them, but many of them begin with coveting. I want someone's possession. I want someone's marriage relationship. I want to take someone's life from them. That's all about coveting. Can we imagine a world where the desire to take someone else's possessions, to take their happiness, to take their life, to take their family, to take their friends, to take whatever from them just ends? You see, all manner of coveting, all manner of evil begins with coveting. If we were to eliminate that, so much of the evil in our world would just stop. There would be no such thing as these evil acts. Those are the terms of the covenant as it pertains to my relationship with other people. And I hope you're able to see that, yes, they're important so that I have a good relationship with other people. But the point of it is, I'm supposed to live in such a way that my good works, my showing of love to other people, becomes an attraction to people out in the world, and they would want the relationship with my God that I have. That is what Yahweh is trying to tell his people with the covenant. We now have to answer the question. If I have been saved, I've entered into the covenant by grace. I have been told that I'm no longer under the law. You know, you have spent all this time, these last 3 weeks, explaining the law, When I go to my church and they say, you're not under the law. You're not held accountable to the law. Why not? Because Jesus did away with the law. We're going to have to work this out. I mean, if we enter into the covenant the same way, and it's the same covenant as in the Old Testament, and we've pretty much established that the New Testament covenant is the same as the Old Testament covenant, and why would I not be held accountable to the terms of the covenant? Maybe we're not, but we need to look at that. We're going to be looking at how Jesus answered that very question. It's important that we hear his answer because he is the one that wrote the law in the first place. So if Jesus feels like the law has been completed, he has completed the law, we're not under the law anymore, okay, then we need to go with that. But if Jesus feels anything else, then we need to understand what his view is in terms of the law. So, spend some time this week looking at the law from the heart standpoint, and then we'll be back next week to investigate the question, am I really under the law anymore after Jesus' death on the cross? Hope y'all have a good week, and I will see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.